So you're probably watching this video on your smartphone, okay? Or perhaps on your computer. Take a moment, look at it. Inside that device, there is copper, cobalt, gold, tin, tantalum, nickel, lithium, and many other minerals. Now imagine someone removes every mineral that came from Africa. What is left? Not much. Now think about that for a second. Africa supplies many of the minerals that power our modern world. Yet, very few of the products we use every day are actually made here in Africa. How can Africa export cobalt and import batteries? How can Africa export copper and import electric engines? How can Africa export diamonds and import luxury jewelry? The question isn't simply about mining. It's about how countries create wealth. Because mining is only the first step. The real value is created after the mineral leaves the ground and transformed. Okay, so for decades, people have tried to explain this problem. Some blame the neo-colonial system that still persists till today. Other blames the rampant corruption in Africa. And other also blame the unfair global trade system towards Africa. Yet all of these reasons are legitimate, okay? They do matter. But today I want to go a little bit deeper, okay? Because before we ask why Africa doesn't manufacture what it mines, we first need to understand how a simple rock becomes a product worth hundreds, sometimes thousands of times more, okay? Welcome back to Art Africa for us, okay? And today we answer one simple question. Why Africa does not manufacture what it mines? So to answer that, we first need to follow the journey of a single mineral, okay? From the mine to the factory. Let's do exactly that. Imagine we discover copper deep underground. We mine it, we load it on a truck, we transport it to a port, and we export it. For many people, that's the end of the story. But in reality, the story is only beginning. The copper is processed, then it is refined, then it is transformed into wire. Okay. That wire is used to make electric engines. Those engines are used to build electrical cars. And those cars are sold all over the world. Now think about this. The copper never changed, okay? It is still the same copper. So why is it now worth so much more when it leaves Africa? Because at every step, someone added value. Someone added knowledge. Someone added skills. Someone added technology, innovation, and design. This idea was explained by Michael Porter, a leading expert on business and competitiveness. Okay. In his book, Competitive Advantage, he introduced the idea of the value chain. The idea is actually very simple. Okay. The value chain is the journey from a raw material to a finished product you buy. And every step along that journey adds more value. Now, let's come back to Africa. As you know, Africa exports many of minerals that the whole world needs, okay? But in many cases, the processing, the refining, the manufacturing, the branding, and even selling take place somewhere else outside of our continent. That means many of the jobs, much of the profits, new technology, and valuable skills are also created somewhere else. So perhaps Africa's biggest challenge is not finding minerals, it is moving beyond the mine. But that raises another question. If every step of the value chain creates more value, why do factories create so much wealth for countries? To answer that, we need to understand why countries fight so hard to build industries. That's the question that change the way economists think about development. Why do countries invest billions of dollars to attract factories? The answer is simple. Factories do not just make products, they actually transform an entire economy. Imagine two countries, okay? Both discover the same amount of copper, okay? The first country, A, exports its copper, okay? Exactly as it came out of the ground, raw, zero transformation. And then you have the second country, country B, that still extract copper. It refines it, turns it into wire, builds engines, and eventually builds electrical vehicles. Now ask yourself, which country creates more jobs? Which country needs more engineers? Which country creates more businesses? Which country develops new technologies? Okay? Which country collects more taxes to invest into schools, roads, and hospitals? The answer is quite simple, quite obvious. The second one, country B. This idea was developed by Danny Roderick, a leading expert on economic development. He explains that countries become richer through what he calls structural transformation. So don't let these words intimidate you, okay? They simply mean moving from activities that create less value to activities that create more value, okay? Mining creates value. Manufacturing creates even more value. Not because factories are magical, okay, but because they create knowledge, workers learn new skills, engineers solve problems, companies become more productive. Innovation spreads, and over time, the whole economy becomes stronger. That is why many of today's countries, wealthiest countries, did not stop at exporting raw materials. They learn how to transform them. Now let's come back to Africa again. Africa exports millions of tons of minerals every year, okay? But much of the processing, the manufacturing, the technology, it's created, like I say, everywhere else, okay? So perhaps Africa's greatest opportunity is not to extract more, I think. I believe it is to transform more. But this leads to an even bigger question. If manufacturing creates prosperity, how did today's richest countries build industry that could compete with the world? To answer that, we need to look at history, okay? So, as I say, history gives us the answer. The world's industrial powers did not appear overnight, okay? They were built. The economist Chang, in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, a book I highly recommend, he studied how many of today's rich countries became wealthy. What he found was surprisingly simple, okay? Countries like Britain, like Germany, the United States, Japan, South Korea, and more recently China, did not become industrial powers by accident. For decades, they invested in building their industries. They built roads, they built railways, they built universities, research centers, yes, financial institutions, and the infrastructure their industries needed to grow. If you watch our previous podcast, Why Africa is Dark at Night from Space, you already know why reliable energy is one of the foundations of industrial development. Okay. I won't repeat those ideas here. If you haven't watched that episode, I advise you to watch it because it explains why no country has ever developed without strong, reliable energy systems. But here's the important point. A factory does not succeed by itself. It depends on many other things working all together. It needs good roads, efficient ports, reliable transport, engineers, technicians, universities, research center, a strong financial system, and businesses that can supply other businesses. In other words, a factory is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. That puzzle is called the ecosystem of an industry. Now, let's come back to Africa. Africa already has many advantages: natural resource, a young population, growing cities, entrepreneurs. Okay. The challenges is no longer finding opportunities, okay? The challenge is connecting all the pieces of the puzzle, because building our factory is one factory, sorry, is not enough. The real question is, what does a strong industry really need to succeed here in Africa? To answer that, let's look at countries that have already moved up the value chain. Botswana. Before we go back to go to Botswana, what does moving up the value chain actually look like? Botswana is one of the world's largest producers of diamonds. Okay, for many years, most of those diamonds left the country to be sorted, cut, and polished somewhere else, outside of Africa. That meant the diamonds created wealth, but much of that wealth was created outside of Botswana. Okay. Then Botswana made a decision, a crucial decision. Okay. Instead of only exporting rough diamonds, it wanted to keep more value inside the country. Working together with industry, it gradually expanded diamond sorting, cutting, and polishing inside Botswana. So, did Botswana become the world's largest jewelry producer? No, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to move one step further along the value chain, and that made a big difference. It created more skilled jobs, more local businesses, more expertise, and more value stayed inside the country. Botswana teaches us an important lesson. A country doesn't need to move from mining to manufacturing overnight. Okay? Every additional step along the value chain creates more opportunity for all. But Botswana also shows us something else. Keeping one more step of the value chain is good. Keeping many steps is even better. So, what happens when a country decides to build an entire industry around its natural resources? Okay, for that, we need to travel to Indonesia in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is one of the world's largest producer of nickel. Okay. Nickel is one of the most important minerals used to manufacture electric vehicle batteries. For many years, Indonesia, like many resource-rich countries, exported raw nickel. Okay. Then it made a bold decision one day. Okay. Instead of simply exporting raw nickel, it encouraged companies to process and refine it inside Indonesia. Okay. To keep more value inside the country. Okay, so the results were remarkable. Billions of dollars were invested in nickel processing manufacturing companies, smelters were built, battery factories followed, industrial parks expand, and thousands of new jobs were created. Okay, today Indonesia is no longer known only for exporting its raw nickel, but it is also becoming an important player in the global battery supply chain. So, does that mean that Indonesia's journey is perfect? Absolutely not. Okay. Like every country, okay, it still faces challenges with its own environment, social issues, and government issues. Okay. But one lesson is clear. Okay. Indonesia did not accept that exporting raw materials was its only option. Okay. It made a strategic decision to capture more value at home. So that is the difference, okay, between selling a resource and building an industry. Now, there's another country that took the idea even further, okay? A country that buys many minerals from others, but still makes many products the whole world uses. China. How did it do that? Let's look. China does not own all of the world's critical minerals. In fact, it imports many of them. Okay. Yet today, it manufactures many of the world's batteries, electric vehicles, electronics, and even equipment for industry. It focused on building factories, training engineers, developing technology, connecting every stage of the value chain. They mastered it. Okay. The economist Ricardo Hassman explains that countries become prosperous, not simply because of the resources they own, but because they develop knowledge, okay? They develop knowledge, skills, ability to produce manufacturing in a more complex way, okay? In other words, a country's greatest wealth is not only what lies beneath its soil, it is also what its people know how to build things. Okay, now let's come back to Africa again. Okay, Africa already has, as you know, all the mineral resources that the world can dream about. Okay, so it has, like I say, a comparative advantages. It has young population, growing cities, entrepreneur, and the largest free trade in the world, which is the African Continental Free Trade, or AFCFTA. So imagine what could happen if copper from Zambia, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, and nickel from Madagascar were increasingly processed, transformed, and manufactured within Africa. Imagine African factories supplying African markets before supplying the rest of the world. That will mean more engineers for us, more technicians for us, more researchers for us, more manufacturers for us, more African companies thriving, and more value staying inside our continent. This is not about copying China or Indonesia or Botswana. Every country must find its own path. That one we agree. But countries become prosperous when they create more value than they export in raw materials. So perhaps the question Africa should ask is no longer how much can we extract? Perhaps the better question is what can we build here? And I believe that is the question that will define Africa's future. So, what have we learned? Africa has never lacked resources. The question was never whether Africa has minerals. We already know the answer, okay? We have it in abundance. The real question is, what do we choose to do with them? President Bola Tinubu said, Africa should stop exporting future as raw materials and import poverty as finished products. Throughout the podcast, we've seen that countries do not become prosperous simply because they own resources. They become prosperous because they transform them. So, before I leave, I want to speak directly to my fellow Africans. For too long, many of us have spent our time asking, who is responsible? That question matters, but it is not enough. We might also start asking better questions. Why are some countries moving faster than others? What are they doing differently? What skill should we learn? What industry should we build? How do we prepare Africa for the next 20 years instead of the last 20 years? The rest of the world is moving forward. Technology is changing. Manufacturing is changing. AI is changing how economies work. Africa cannot afford to watch from the sidelines. Today, knowledge has never been more accessible. Books, research, universities, online courses, experts. We have fewer excuses than any generation before us not to learn. So let us read more, learn more, question more, understand more, because the better our questions become, the better our decisions will become. Africa's future will not be built by complaints alone. It will be built by Africans like us who are curious enough to understand how the world works and bold enough to build something better. So, this is Ad Africa for us. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, share, and comment, and I'll see you for the next episode.